Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Lindstrom, and I'm currently on the advisory board of the International Dyslexia Association Georgia branch. Thank you all for joining us as we host the third webinar in the Spotlight on Structured Literacy Wednesday webinar series. We are so happy to have all of you with us this evening, and if you're watching this at a later time, welcome. I would like to thank all the sponsors and supporters who made this series possible. The IDA Georgia is so honored to be partnering with the Reading League of Georgia and hosting this series. I would also like to thank the IDA Georgia Webinar Series Planning Committee, Lisa Murray and Kim Day, co-chairs, myself, Jennifer Lindstrom, speakers, Anne Marie Lewis, registration and certificates, Mary McPherson, thank you so much for the Zoom support, Jen Birch and Nora Schlesinger, sponsors, Rachel Pierce and Delilah Landrum, marketing, and Nicole Vella from the Reading League of Georgia. The purpose of this webinar series is to spotlight both the content and the principles of instruction supported by research on the teaching of reading. Structured literacy emphasizes teaching reading skills explicitly and systematically. If you've not yet taken the opportunity to watch our previous two Spotlight on Structured Literacy webinars, I strongly encourage you to do so. In our first webinar, Dr. Jan Hasbrook talked about the importance of reading fluency and its relationship to comprehension. In our second webinar, Dr. Margie Gillis shared her expertise on how to support students' ability to comprehend sentences. Tonight, we have the honor to hear from Dr. Jeanette Mancilla-Martinez, who will discuss the many parallels between the underlying process of English reading development among English-proficient students and dual language learners. She will discuss the unique developmental considerations for best supporting dual language learners' reading development and achievement. Dr. Jeanette Mancilla-Martinez is an associate professor in the special education department, as well as associate dean for academic affairs and graduate education at Peabody College. She holds an MED and EDD in language and literacy from Harvard University, as well as a BA in liberal studies with a concentration in English and Spanish from Mount St. Mary's College. She is a 2013 National Academy of Education Spencer Postdoctoral Fellow, a 2013 Hellman Fellow, a 2017 English Language Learners Policy Fellow. Jeanette's program of research is focused on advancing students' language and reading comprehension outcomes, including those of students from linguistically diverse and low-income homes. Her research is anchored on reading development with a focus on the central role of supporting students' language comprehension to mitigate later reading comprehension difficulties. Her most recent work examines the intersection of language and special education status. Jeanette was appointed to the National Assessment of Education Progress Standing Committee on Reading in 2017, is a research affiliate for Tennessee Education Research Alliance, and she serves on the Early Literacy Advisory Council for the Tennessee Department of Education. You can see that Dr. Mancilla-Martinez is very busy, so we are so honored that she has agreed to speak with us this evening, and we are so excited to learn from you. So without further ado, I will pass the torch and we will learn from you, and we're so excited. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone who's able to join us live, and hello to everyone who is watching the recording. I am really thrilled at the opportunity to present this evening and to share a sprinkling of the work that I have done in an effort to better support and understand the reading development and achievement of a very rapidly growing population of learners, often referred to as dual language learners. So this evening, what I have in store for you, and it was so hard to pare it down to a couple of items, is that we're going to start off with a very quick overview of the reading and social demographic landscape in the United States. And then I'm going to really highlight two key pieces of work that I've been doing more recently. And one is anchored on teacher beliefs, and the other really centered on language assessments. And That's going to be followed by a couple of key points I hope that you all walk away with, and that I'm calling opportunities. And then I'm really excited to get into the meat of this, which is the discussion, and hopefully address some of the questions that you have, or at least point you in the right direction if I don't have the immediate answer. So once again, thank you so much, and let's go ahead and get started. So I always like to start my presentations by giving my audience an understanding of the theoretical underpinnings of the work that I conduct. And some of you may be very familiar, maybe some of you a little less familiar with the notion of the simple view of reading. Sometimes can be a little controversial in terms of, is it too simplistic? I really like the simple view of reading in the sense that it's very parsimonious and exactly simple, which I think is really tangible in terms of instructional implications. So I didn't explicitly show the simple view of reading kind of model, so to speak, and decided to show the Scarborough strands that many of you may be familiar with, because it's really an extension, so to speak, of the simple view of reading. And the part that I really appreciate most about this theoretical model has to do with the increasingly automatic nature of word recognition in being so important for skilled reading. And more than anything, about the increasingly strategic nature of language comprehension. So the two key components are language comprehension, which can be proxied in many different ways, as you can see below, not an exhaustive list, and word recognition. And what really tends to happen is that if a student is struggling with one, the other, or both of these areas, it's really difficult to have skilled reading, to make meaning from the text that you're reading. And in most US classrooms, the focus tends to be on word recognition in the primary grade years, roughly K-2. And that's really understandable because the majority of K students, for example, at kindergarten entry are not reading yet. But students generally come in with language skills, right? And so initially the text that they're reading at the language level is not too difficult, so to speak. But over time, if you can think about, I don't want to do like a total like difference that third grade is somehow magical or fourth grade, and now it's comprehension, quite the contrary. But once you get into the upper elementary grade years and above, and you're reading content area textbooks, for example, history, social studies, science, the language that is embedded in those texts that presumably you can actually read the printed words really become the differentiating factor between students who understand the meaning of the text that they're reading and those that do not. And this theoretical kind of framing has really been supported by a lot of empirical research that has been anchored on monolingual English speakers and also on speakers from linguistically diverse homes. And in fact, the simple view of reading was initially, the sample was initially a group of bilingual students that not many really recognize or know. And so when we think about, all right, well, we know quite a bit, I feel, about the science of reading and the scientific underpinnings of reading development and how to support it, it becomes really a perplexing situation to think that in the US, reading achievement has remained stagnant and is an area of concern for many, many decades. And so roughly 1 in 3 US students, and this is an example at 4th grade, similar profile at 8th grade in terms of a national sampling, can read at or above the proficient level. I happen to have 3 boys, 3 of a kind, and if only one of them were able to read at or above the proficient level, I would not be satisfied with that. And I think as educators, as researchers, policymakers, advocates, we certainly should not be happy with this national profile. And this is not disaggregated by any means. It's not by income status, by language status, by race, ethnicity, etc. This is the national profile, which of course includes monolingual English speakers. But then we get to the situation of, and some people think, well, could it really be because this national profile is really heavily influenced by students whose first language is not English? And that's not exactly the case. So what I want to really point out here is that I feel that we are still stuck in a situation in most US classrooms where we're in this kind of waiting to fail model in terms of the current testing mechanisms that are available in school. So as I showcased just a bit ago, what tends to happen is that there's a big focus, understandably, at the word level, at the word recognition level in the earlier grades, and not so much on language comprehension and on assessing students' language skills. The key exception to that are students who are not from monolingual English-speaking homes. And this population of learners is often referred to formally in school settings as NELB. And I'm sorry for a lot of acronyms. I try to explain those as much as possible, and I'm happy to answer questions that you may have if there's any confusion. But NELB stands for non-English language background. And this is the official school designated term for students who are from a home in which a language, any language, other than or in addition to English is used. And this is a really important point because it basically refers to every child who is not from a monolingual English-speaking home, NELB. And so this group of learners, we sometimes try to, make things a little bit simple, right? And say, oh, well, they either are monolingual or they're bilingual. Of course, you could be trilingual, et cetera, multilingual. But just for simplicity's sake, there tends to be this contrast of yes or no. And in fact, language use is very, very much on a gradient. And there's different levels of ability receptively, expressively across contexts if you're in the home setting as opposed to a formal school setting in terms of your language abilities and skill. And so NELB students really do come from homes where language other than English is used. And so what happens is this is the population of learners who actually the parents all have to fill out a home language survey. So I'm going to briefly walk you through what that process is like. And once the parents fill out a home language survey at school entry, for simplicity's sake, let's say at kindergarten entry, if a language other than English is indicated as being spoken in the home, and these, I won't read them to you, but these are the typical 3 home language survey questions that are posed to parents or caregivers. And if the answer is a language other than English at home, those students get flagged. And what I mean by flagged is it is assumed that students from NELB backgrounds are not proficient in English. And the way to figure out if they are or if they're not is by taking a language screener. So what happens is, parent says monolingual English, we speak English at home, that's it. It's sort of assumed that the English skills of those students are adequate to access curriculum in English. And hopefully I will remember to go back to that, but that is not a correct assumption. If the parents indicated a language other than English is spoken in the home, then this language screener is given to assess the language skills and figure out if students need support, English language supports. If they pass the screener, then they're dubbed as being English proficient. They do not require English learner services. If the student does not pass the screener, then hold on a minute. For all intents and purposes, the idea here is let's provide extra English language support services so that students can access the curriculum in English and flourish. But unfortunately, and we'll get to that later, the quality of the English learner support services vary widely, and there's often a cycle of watered down instruction for students who are classified as English learner. But ideally, they would get the English language support that they need, be able to access the curriculum in English, and they're monitored until they are English proficient. So I hope this was clear-ish enough in terms of the process of identifying students as English learners or not. And so then what happens here is that I think there's a big equity issue that we really need to think about. And I hope folks consider this really seriously in terms of just the actual process of who gets to assess on academic English language skills. And the only children who uniformly get assessed are those who come from a non-native English speaking home. And we know, and I know from research that I have conducted and others, that a lot of US students, including students from English only homes, need a lot more support on language development in the service of English reading comprehension. So it's no surprise that we have this 1 in 3 profile at the national level, again, not disaggregated by language status. But then when we do disaggregate by language status and we look at the national profile, it is really depressing and concerning. And so here you see 1 in 10 US students who can read at or above the proficient level if they are formally classified as English learner. And in fact, this is an optimistic picture because it's more like something around 8% of 4th graders and 4% of 8th graders that can read at or above the proficient level if they are identified as being limited English proficient as English learners. On the one hand, this is not entirely surprising, right? The assessments that are administered in almost all US school settings are English only, including the NAEP reading assessment. And so if a student is still developing English proficiency, it should come as no surprise to anyone that English learners tend to continue to exhibit lower English reading comprehension outcomes. But the reality then is that this population of learners is a vastly heterogeneous population of learners, nothing homogeneous about this population, even though some folks may think that. And so these students they represent multiple languages and cultures and parts of the world, although the majority in the US are from Spanish-speaking homes. They also represent a very wide range of socioeconomic status, although a lot of students, especially ELs from Spanish-speaking homes, tend to come from lower income homes. And probably one of the most important pieces that I want to share tonight is that this population of learners tends to be largely US born. That means that they are US citizens and they have been instructed in US schools since at least formal school entry at kindergarten, if not during the early childhood years. And in the US context, the majority of students are instructed in English only programs. That does not mean, and I'm not ignoring the fact that there are some amazing dual language programs out there, but the vast majority are English only. So this begs a whole lot of questions as to why we have such a low percentage of students who are English learners, US born, US citizens, who are not yet at developing the English language proficiency that they need for overall academic achievement. And there are so many reasons that we can think about, and by no means is this an exhaustive list of different factors that might influence this national profile that we see. But what I want to really focus on today, because I had to be selective necessarily, is on this idea of teacher knowledge and teacher expectations, which really relates to the shortage of qualified teachers to address the academic needs of this population of learners, and the issue of learning disabilities, of course. And so I do want to point out that English learners are really not somebody else's problem. And maybe many years ago, someone could say, well, there are no English learners at my school, or no NELB students from non-English language backgrounds. You'd be very hard pressed to go across almost any classroom in the US and not find students who are non-English language background, and within that group, a subset of students who are formally identified as English learners. You can see the state of Georgia there. This is the presentation for today, but it is all over the US, meaning the representation of English learners. And so then what I really want you to think about is that the demographic characteristics of the US school-age population really has already changed. It's changing, but it has already changed in terms of so much diversity in all respects of the word. But the profile of the educator workforce has not changed within the same pace. So there might be questions that are raised about the extent to which the educator workforce is really equipped with the knowledge base that they need to support this population of learners. And so if teachers don't have the qualifications and maybe not the expectations of success for English learners, that's going to be really problematic. And we want to make sure that teachers have the knowledge that they need to best support the academic needs of all students, including students who are English learners. And so what I'm going to do next then is really key in on this idea of teacher beliefs. And so how do teacher beliefs around issues of bilingualism and bilingual development relate to actual achievement outcomes of this population of learners? And so when we think about teachers and linguistic diversity, broadly speaking, in the classroom, again, I reiterate that we have this changing and changed student demographic characteristics, but that has not kept pace with the teacher workforce characteristics that remain largely homogeneous. And there is evidence and reports that teachers tend to report feeling underprepared to adequately meet the academic needs of students who come from linguistically diverse homes. And really of key concern is that teachers also have expressed deficit-oriented beliefs and deficit-oriented attitudes towards what English learners can and cannot do. And so I really got interested in this question about, well, sometimes we have a lot of anecdotal stories, right? And that there's nothing wrong with that. But as researchers, I think it's really important to dig in and see, well, is there actually, what do teachers actually believe? And within an exploration of what they believe, how does that, if at all, relate to actual student achievement? And so I'm not going to do this work justice. I conducted this study in collaboration with my wonderful doctoral student, almost PhD, Min Oh. And this study really focused on characterizing teacher beliefs. And if anyone is interested, please contact me directly for additional information. I do have the citation for the paper there, which is in Elementary School Journal. We essentially had two big buckets of beliefs. Those that we called development-focused beliefs, and those are like in the beige, which is two monolingual views, asset view and bilingual development understanding, and another bucket of beliefs that we called instruction-focused beliefs. And those really dealt with having lenient expectations, English standard, and English only achievement. And to spare you too much of the details, we conducted analyses to actually come up with these different factors. So we have these 6 factors, and within these 6 factors, we have the development-focused, instruction-focused beliefs. And what we really wanted to find out is, do any of these beliefs actually relate to the English reading comprehension of students who are English learners? And this is essentially what we found. Within the development-focused beliefs, 2 factors emerged as significant and positively related to students' English reading comprehension outcomes. And that was asset view and bilingual development understanding. In brief, asset view really captured this idea that young children who are exposed to more than one language can master those languages, and that young children actually can keep 2 languages separate and use each language when necessary. Bilingual development understanding really dealt with this notion that children learn the language used at school from peers and siblings, and that when children use words and letter sounds from a first language when writing in English at school, there's evidence that the child is making use of all of their linguistic resources. In contrast, when we look at the instruction-focused beliefs, we found 2 factors that were also related to students' English reading comprehension, but these were negatively related. And those were lenient expectations and English-only achievement. So what do we mean by this? Well, lenient expectations really dealt with this idea that when a child is kind of hesitant to speak up in the classroom, that it's okay for teachers to just wait until the child wants to speak. That it's not appropriate to use grade level text to teach ELs when their reading ability is below grade level, and that it's really important to value effort sort of over achievement when assessing English learners. So this is what was captured by something like, we called lenient expectations. The other factor from the instruction-focused beliefs that was negatively related to students' English reading comprehension was English-only achievement. And this really dealt with the notion that it is okay for English learners to disengage from the academically difficult parts of a lesson, that providing accommodations on assignments, for example, is not fair to those who are not ELs, and that it's actually a good practice to lessen the quantity of coursework for students who are English learners. So when we thought about all of this, and I'm giving you just a brief snapshot of this work, there are so many implications that we feel we can derive from this study and the results. But one of the most important is that fostering what is an asset-driven and really an evidence-based approach to supporting English learners' reading achievement is really going to be important, right? What the teachers believe hopefully is based on actual scientific evidence. And we also feel that an important implication is that the negative role of hopefully well-intentioned leniency, right? I just discussed the lenient expectations, really highlights the need to provide appropriately challenging content for English learners and of course, linguistic input that is of high quality. So to actually have that expectation. And I cannot underscore this enough, but an important implication from this work as well is that professional development, and I know that a lot of educators for really good reasons are tired of hearing this, but that professional development and ongoing sustained training opportunities to really cultivate these research-informed teacher beliefs about what ELs can do in terms of their language development and learning are just non-negotiable. And I'm really excited to hear what folks think about this, this study and the implications that I just discussed. So knowing kind of, and at least getting a little taste about the relationship between teacher beliefs and student actual English reading comprehension achievement, again, centered on English learners, it really becomes so important to really zero in then on the role of language assessments. And I started talking about that a bit just a while ago in terms of the mechanism that is in place for identifying and reclassifying English learners at the beginning of the presentation. So what I'm going to do in the next couple of minutes in terms of language assessments is really zero in on the two interrelated issues of special education identification among this population of learners and the academic expectations that we have. Of course, there are so many relationships naturally across these strands of research. So another term that is often used out in the literature is long-term English learners. It sounds a little bit self-explanatory, but these are English learners who have been English learners for a long time. Generally, most folks tend to agree that this refers to students who are identified as limited English proficient, as English learners, and are not making the progress to be reclassified as English proficient within a roughly 6-year timeline. That means that a student who started at kindergarten was identified as being an English learner can go on and start middle school and still be identified as an English learner because he or she has not developed the requisite academic English language proficiency, the threshold to pass the test and be reclassified. That is super concerning, right? When we think about the fact that most of this population of learners is US born, has been in US classrooms, largely in English only instructional environment. So one of the questions that may naturally be raised is, could there be a learning disability? Is there a different, like cognitively based reason that students are not being reclassified as English proficient? And of course, reading is language-based. And as I showcased just a minute ago, reading is already an area of concern for US children generally, and especially for English learners. And so when we think about this, we really need to think about this relationship between specific learning disability, which assumes reading difficulty, and English learners, right? Is it because of the limited English proficiency? Is it a lack of appropriate instruction? It could be in other subject areas, but I'm going to focus on reading. And of course, specific learning disability can coexist with limited English proficiency. That is a fact. That's not a fact that many people recognize, but it is a fact. And so we have at minimum issues about valid assessments and questions about disproportionality in the representation of this population of learners in special education. And I'm first going to tackle and just dabble a little bit into the valid assessment limitations and then return to disproportionality. So in terms of the valid assessments, I really like to showcase the revised hierarchical model, the RHM, Kroll and colleagues, and a lot of others who have contributed to this line of research to really understand the scientific nature of dual or multi-language development. And there is generally consensus that concepts are shared between languages. And there are links between your first language, let's say Spanish, and the second language, let's say English. And of course, the concepts and there's going to vary as a function of the weaker language, right? If you're more proficient in one compared to the other. And students, and like including adults, have differential experience in their exposure to the multiple languages that they might negotiate. And we also need to consider the lifespan, the differences in their experience and in their proficiency across the lifespan. So one of the most important points, if this sounds confusing, and I'm happy to discuss it more, is that we cannot think of children who are bilinguals, obviously it could be trilinguals or more, as just being two monolinguals in one person. But unfortunately, the way that we assess students in school settings, if we are lucky enough to assess beyond using English-only measures, we use measures in the other language, let's say Spanish, which effectively treats a child who is a Spanish, English dual language learner as two monolinguals in one. And that is going to be really problematic and not really capturing what students know and can do. And so I just want to showcase briefly what typical standardized assessment, and I'm going to focus on the vocabulary level, in terms of how you might score a vocabulary assessment, which is a measure of language comprehension, of course, and what is considered a correct and an incorrect response. So typically, students are only administered an English-only measure, let's say a vocabulary. So if you administer that measure and the student responds in, say, Spanish, that has to be marked wrong. And I have evidence of this many times, especially in my years as a doctoral student, when I did more of the actual data collection of students responding in quote unquote the wrong language, which there is no such thing as a wrong language, but there is a wrong language when it comes to standardized approaches and scoring. And I understand that, of course, right? So if they did not provide the label in the correct response in English, it's wrong. And you might say, oh, but I know they know the concept. Doesn't matter. Same thing happens if you say, well, this child is from a Spanish-speaking home, so let's assess their Spanish vocabulary. That's going to give us a more robust, comprehensive understanding of their vocabulary skills than focusing only on English. Well, the same situation can occur in which a student, if they respond in Spanish, great, beautiful, awesome, they got the credit. But if they happen to respond in English because they know that word, that label in the wrong language, which in this case is English, they also have to be marked wrong in terms of the standardized procedures for administering and scoring the assessment. So that for many, many years really worried me and continues to worry me in terms of how we are depicting the skills of students who have linguistic resources across more than one language. And what I have been doing for several years now, and I'm certainly not the first one, hopefully will not be the last one, is really thinking about these assessments that are called conceptually scored. The idea here is that if it is a Spanish-English bilingual child, they can respond in either of their languages, Spanish or English, and get credit for the item. So an easy example would be table, right? If it's an English only assessment, they must say table. If they said mesa, wrong. Opposite is also true. Spanish only assessment, you show them a picture of a table. They said they don't know mesa, but they said table, wrong. In the Spanish-English bilingual scoring approach, you show them the picture of that table and they can give you the label in either language, because what you're after is the conceptual knowledge, the conceptual understanding, not a lexical specific item. And so you might say, all right, well, that sounds great, but like, how does this look in reality, right? So this is an example of work I did, oh my gosh, now it's more than 10 years ago when I was finishing my doctoral studies with my advisor at the time, Noni Lasso. And we administered these assessments that are expressive vocabularies from the Woodcock Language Proficiency Battery. So these are W-score that are comparable across English and Spanish. The black line, I'll be very brief, is the national norms, and it's applicable to both Spanish and English. And we had a sample of students from Spanish-speaking homes, and we followed them from the fall of preschool all the way through 5th grade. So from age 4.5-ish to about age 11. And we just wanted to get a developmental understanding. At this time, there was a lot less work focused on this population of learners. Luckily, there's been a lot more work on this population of learners. And as you can see, for both English, which is the blue longer dashed line, and for Spanish, which is the red shorter dashed line, students who are from Spanish-speaking homes in this sample were below national norms in both languages. But there's a pretty big difference in terms of Spanish, right? By the end of 5th grade, students are more than 3 standard deviations below national norms in Spanish. Not surprising, because these are students who are being educated in basically monolingual English context, not provided with Spanish literacy instruction. And in English, although comparatively it looks better, there's still a full standard deviation below national norms on their English expressive vocabulary, again, despite the English instructional context. And these measures are for English monolingual speakers, Spanish monolingual speakers. So again, treating bilinguals as 2 monolinguals in one. This here is more recent work that I conducted while I have been at Vanderbilt. And this is really now using the expressive vocabulary, but based on conceptual scoring. And that's the approach in which students can answer in either language. And very simply, the black line, which you can hardly see, there's a black dashed line above where it says 2nd grade cohort, and there's a dotted black line, that's a kindergarten cohort. We have 2 cohorts of students that we followed for 3 years when students were either in kindergarten or in 2nd grade, and we followed them through their 2nd grade year or 4th grade year. And as you can see, the reason that the blue and red lines seem to overlap the black lines is really showcasing that there is not actually a gap. Very different profile from what you see here when we use these approaches that are based on conceptual scoring, where it allows students to respond in either language instead of in English only or Spanish only. So to me, this is by itself really promising results, and it raises a lot of questions about just a teacher, what he or she might see at the beginning of the year when they see a profile like this compared to a profile like this in terms of the teacher expectations about the academic achievement and potential of English learners and NELB students more broadly. So the next piece, and I told you I would come back to this when we're really thinking about specific learning disability coexisting with limited English proficiency, which of course can happen. And there I just discussed the questions surrounding valid assessments for this population of learners, has to do with disproportionality. It is a very contentious and complex topic. And there's been a lot more research on disproportionality in terms of race and ethnicity in the US than there has been on disproportionality by language status. And that's the work that I have engaged in most recently. So essentially what I wanted to show you here is the percentage of English learners compared to students who are not identified as English learners in what are considered the top disability categories under IDEA. And overall, across disability categories, about 50% of the US population is identified who are ELs. But again, this intersection of English learner and special education status really does remain understudied, despite the fast growing population of English learners and NELB students more broadly in the US. And I think your eye already caught the specific learning disability category, where there is a lot of contentious findings, and SLD subsumes reading comprehension difficulties, my area of research and of concern, and the area that I want to best support students in. And the new equity regulations in IDEA really press on the question of disproportionality, because the goal is to provide students with the services that they need. So this study, I'm going to show you a couple of slides that are really anchored on the issue of, is there under, over, or proportionate representation of students in special education depending on their language status. And this is a pretty new paper that was just published this year in Educational Researcher that I conducted with collaborators of mine. And just to orient you, this is based on Tennessee state level data. And we have data from academic year 2009/2010, extending all the way to 2018-2019, so a decade, spanning a decade. And what we really wanted to get a descriptive snapshot of the extent to which there may or may not be differences in the identification of students in special education depending on their language status. And we really focused on 3 key language groups. NES refers to students who are native English speakers, basically monolingual English speakers. And what I'm showcasing here, and I'll explain in a bit when I change the ratio, is a risk ratio. And a risk ratio necessarily is unadjusted. So this is completely descriptive, not controlling for any background characteristics of the students. And this is really what the states go by to determine whether or not there's disproportionality. If the risk ratio is 3.0 or above for 3 consecutive years, so not like 1 year was 3.0, another year 2.0, the next year 4.0, those are kind of aberrations. So to account for that, if the risk ratio is 3.0 or above for 3 consecutive years in a row, then there is flags of significant disproportionality. As you can see from the scale here on this graph, the risk ratio does not get to 3, right? It extends only to 2. So we don't have evidence of significant disproportionality based on the thresholds of 3.0 for 3 consecutive years. So for native English speakers, the risk ratio is just hovering right above 1.5. 1 would be exactly proportional representation. But what does this look like then when we look at students who are not from native English speaking homes? So then we added this category of students who we are calling EPBs. These are English proficient bilinguals. What this means is, if you recall back, jog your memory to the beginning of the presentation, we had students who are non-English language background, basically anyone who is not NES from monolingual English speaking homes. And within that group of non-English language background students, if they are proficient in English, they are considered English proficient. So this is that group of students. They are not from monolingual English only homes, but they are proficient in English. And you can see that their risk ratios, you don't need a statistical analysis for this, are well below the risk ratios of native English speakers, right? So that's interesting. Then we looked at students who are formally classified as English learners, who we're calling current ELs, which is the orange line here. And you can also see that current ELs, their representation in special education in the state of Tennessee, spanning a decade, falls below that of native English speakers and a little bit above that of English proficient bilinguals. So current ELs actually are the group that tend to be sort of proportional at the level of 1.0 risk ratio across a decade. So you might say, well, does this mean that these questions and issues surrounding disproportionality of English learners in certain categories are unwarranted, or what's going on? Unfortunately, what you're seeing here are the representation rates across all disability categories, not by specific disability category. But before I even get to that, I also want to highlight a couple of the findings that are anchored on income status. And we know that poverty, unfortunately, is a risk factor for a whole slew of potential negative life outcomes, including compromised academic achievement. And as I mentioned earlier, a disproportionate percentage of students who are non-English language background, and specifically if they are classified as English learner, tend to come from lower income homes. That is not all, and I'm not here to stereotype or generalize to the whole population, but disproportionately English learners in the US, especially those from Spanish-speaking homes, tend to be overrepresented in poverty. And in the state of Tennessee, as is the case nationally, most of the English learners are also from lower income homes and from Spanish-speaking homes. So we were really interested in digging deeper, right? As researchers, you might imagine that's what we wanted to do, and say, well, what do these risk ratios look like if we really account for income status? So what I'm going to show you here, this is the group that is native English speakers. So you can think of these as monolingual English speakers. And the black line represents students who are from higher income homes. The blue line represents students' risk ratios across this decade span that are from lower income homes. And it's probably pretty easy to tell that students who are native English speakers who come from higher income homes tend to have a higher likelihood of being represented in special education across any category relative to their native English speaking peers who are from lower income homes. But the picture changes quite dramatically when we look at students who are not native English speakers. So this next graph will show you English proficient bilinguals. So you can probably pretty easily appreciate that for students who are English proficient bilinguals, and to reorient you, these are students from homes in which a language other than English is spoken, but the students themselves are English proficient. Whether you are from a higher or a lower income homes, it's kind of indistinguishable in terms of your risk ratio, and pretty consistently across the board, hovering at about the 0.5. So there are questions of potential under identification in special education across all categories for students who are from English proficient backgrounds. When we look at English learners and we examine the role of income status, we get essentially the flip of what we got for English proficient students. Now we see that if you are an English learner from a higher income home, you tend to have a lower chance of being represented in special ed. But if you're from a lower income home and you're an English learner, you have a higher probability, a higher risk ratio of being in special education. So what does this all mean? Well, at minimum, it means that there is something about language status, certainly something about income status that relates to special education identification. And it's really hard to say that that is not something that is at play and needs further investigation. And income status, language status should be exclusionary criteria for most of the disability categories, and especially when we think about specific learning disability. So here, what I want to show you is what we get when we zone in on one category, which subsumes reading difficulties, and this is SLD. So same orientation here in the sense of, if you're wondering who are these people now, what we have here is the same colors. So in this case, I'm showing you odds ratios. And the reason that we switch from risk ratios, which are unadjusted, to odds ratios is that now on the left side, you have the unadjusted analysis, not accounting for anything, just very descriptive. On the right side, you have what are called adjusted results. That means a lot of folks that have conducted work on disproportionality really ask questions about, well, if they are similarly situated students. So let's say we analytically control for income status, for their academic achievement, etc., for these background characteristics and factors that we know influence, for example, rates of representation. Would we get a different profile? And some researchers who have conducted that work actually find that when you adjust for these covariates, that students are more likely, if they're from minority backgrounds, racial and ethnic minority backgrounds, to be more likely to be represented in special education. We're kind of finding the opposite when we look at language status. And this is not unique. Others have found a similar trend of potential underrepresentation. So basically on the right, when we adjust for these covariates that others have adjusted for, we pretty consistently see that students who are English proficient bilinguals, that's the blue triangle, and who are current English learners, that's the orange circle, tend to be less likely to be identified for specific learning disabilities. If we didn't make those adjustments, on the left, you do see that current ELs, the orange circles, they tend to be more likely to be represented in the category of specific learning disability. But with the adjustments, we see that that tends to not be the case. Now, I'm also interested in the discussion and hearing your thoughts about the extent to which we should or should not conduct adjusted analysis. I have my own thoughts about that, but I'm going to save them to see if somebody brings that up. But again, as a researcher, I feel it's really important to conduct different types of analyses and showcase results to really make a more informed conclusions, so to speak, or at least implications or for future directions of research for an issue that matters a whole lot, and that is to provide the services that students actually need. And so that I'm going to segue directly now to just a couple of the opportunities that I hope that you leave this presentation with today. There was so much I could have potentially covered, but I thought, we had to be selective here. So one of the most important pieces is that I hope everyone will recognize that that the population of non-English language background students is really a vastly diverse group of learners that are largely US born, US citizens, that although hundreds of languages are represented in their homes across the nation, the vast majority tend to be, there are differences depending on the region of the US, of course, but largely from Spanish-speaking homes, that's the most common. And that even though there is variation in the language of instruction, most students tend to be instructed in English-only context across all regions of the US. I also hope that folks can reflect on the typical characterization of non-English language background students generally, and current ELs specifically, as being quote unquote at risk. You really need to think about what are they at risk for and why is that characterization so prevalent. Speaking another language is not a risk factor. And so if you can walk away just with that nugget of information, that would be a win in my view. We really should avoid framing conversations in terms of quote unquote challenges of working with NELB students, whether they're English proficient or still in the process of developing English proficiency. And I really hope that we pay a lot more attention to the type of measures that are used in everyday classroom settings in terms of what kind of profile you might get about the abilities of students who are NELB. So as you hopefully can see from the brief examples I provided, the vocabulary trajectories look vastly, starkly different if you use measures that are monolingual only, even if you say, I'm going to use a monolingual only measure and in English and a monolingual only measure in Spanish, then if you really think about the scientific understandings and underpinnings of bilingual language acquisition and development and use something like the conceptually scored measures. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that as well. And of course, the idea of opportunities to learn versus potential to learn is a super important one, especially now on the heels of the pandemic, where unfortunately, at least in my current home state of Tennessee, and I have read reports across the nation, there are already indicators of the big differences in terms of the access to quality instruction and language learning opportunities for students from lower income homes, students with disabilities, students who are English learners. And now imagine the intersection of all of that. And like all learners, students who are NELB obviously can't succeed. And this raises questions of, in my mind, of the category often called gifted and talented, gifted and intellectually gifted. And I couldn't miss the opportunity to show you a tiny bit of new work that I'm conducting with colleagues that is focused on the notion of giftedness and the representation of students from different language backgrounds. And so you've been seeing odds ratios related to disability categories. In Tennessee, intellectually gifted is also considered under the exceptionalities and students get an IEP. This is based on data from the state of Tennessee. NES are native English speakers. Then at the very top, we have students who we're calling never English learners. And then we have in the middle, the little triangle, students who used to be English learners and were reclassified. And at the very bottom are the current English learners. And I won't spend too much time on this graph, but I think that it is pretty clear to see that current English learners are minimally represented as being intellectually gifted. And that is a problem. The data here spans only through 2016-17, because beyond that year, in the most recent years, there are fewer than a handful of English learners identified as intellectually gifted. And I think this is my last opportunity slide here. So we're towards the end now, is really the idea that reading instruction for NELB students is so similar in terms of the influencing factors for students who are monolingual English speakers and students who are from homes in which a language other than or in addition to English is used. I didn't spend tons of time talking about that because I wanted to showcase the teacher believed work and the disproportionality work, which is much newer, that I have recently conducted. But I have done quite a bit of research in terms of looking at the key factors that influence English reading comprehension among NALB students and ELs in particular. And unsurprisingly, word reading is non-negotiable, and so is language comprehension. And I can't say enough about the need for targeted and explicit word reading instruction, and especially on decoding. And so this is an area that I know comparatively there's a lot more work on word recognition, but for English learners, and some of my more recent work in the state of Tennessee, which is often considered a new immigrant destination state, students' decoding skills in particular seem to need a lot more support than I expected. And without question, the need for sustained and purposeful language development support is so important. This is important for whether you're a monolingual English speaker. I think in US classrooms, we can do a lot better in terms of supporting language development. And I know that there are a lot of reasons why it's comparatively much harder to assess language and then to provide developmentally appropriate support. But we need to have students given more opportunities to actively use language in the classroom, including for students who are developing their English proficiency. And so, okay, this was my last one. I thought that was the other one was. In terms of this intersection of language and special education status, I'm in the middle of writing up a proposal, I should say, that really is going to zero in on better understanding the referral process for students who are not monolingual English speakers. Not only English learners, but just students who come from a non-English language background. Currently, the equity regulations and IDEA establish a system that is very specific for identifying significant disproportionality, but this is anchored on overrepresentation. There is currently no guidance on underrepresentation, and at least the work that I've been conducting in the state of Tennessee really points to some issues of underrepresentation. And ultimately what matters, it's not about, is it under, is it over, is there misrepresentation? Are students not getting the kind of instruction that they need that is optimal for their actual achievement? And with that, I will go ahead and open it up for discussion. And I thank you for listening to me this evening.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mancilla-Martinez. That was very insightful, and I know I have lots of questions myself, so we really appreciate all of the time you put into sharing that information, especially all of the data that you've collected and the studies you've conducted looking at disproportionality, risk factors, and so on. And I do appreciate at the end that you mentioned the importance of instruction in reading that is grounded in research. So I'm going to start there with our questions, given that our focus on this webinar series is Spotlight on Structured Literacy. So we're going to start with that. Let me pull up some of these questions here, and thank you for those who are participating this evening for writing in with some questions. And I also have some questions that were submitted at the registration.
Okay, great.
Okay, so this question came from somebody who registered. How is the science of reading different? And I'm going to also use the term structured literacy. So the approach to reading instruction, I think, is where this participant was coming from. Mm-hmm. How is it different for multilingual or dual language students compared to English proficient dual language learners? So is there a difference? And if so, how is it different?
Yeah, well, that's a big question and a super important one. And I think that my most straightforward answer is that the difference in terms of the support that you might provide a student who is not monolingual English speaking and one who is really probably not going to be super satisfying, but it really depends on the skills the student has across both of their languages. So one of the easiest and understandable kind of conceptualizations is you're bilingual or you're not bilingual. And I mentioned that earlier, but you can be a student from a home in which your parents speak Spanish, let's say, but the student, him or herself, does not have a lot of Spanish skill. They might have some receptively, but not as much productively. And so if you were to, and this has happened to me when I was an actual teacher, and certainly I've gotten a lot of questions about this over the years, if you assess that student in Spanish because you have some concern about their English development, you may actually get results that worry you even more. And by that, I mean, they are not able to perform at a standardized level that is, at par or normed for students at, let's say, first or second grade. And you might say, there must be really a red flag here because I have some concerns about their English and now I assess them in their home language and it's also low. So I think that's the reason it becomes so tricky to really think about, well, what is the best approach? And ultimately, the factors are not different. So students need word reading development and support in word reading, letter sound correspondence. If we're thinking about, and I'm going to call it the science of reading, they also need to have a lot of language knowledge. And so in terms of the language itself, it's really easy to think about linguistically diverse learners as being comparatively more lacking, so to speak, for lack of a better word, in language development, specifically in English, if we think about their developmental experience, right? So the big difference between students who are from a monolingual English speaking home and students who are non-English language background is precisely the fact that they are from a non-English language background, right? That they are negotiating another language at home. So it's really easy to then think, oh, well, they must be lacking. They must need something very different. And over the years of my experience in the classroom, over the years of my experience in the research that I've conducted, I would not say that students who are linguistically diverse have different needs, so to speak. At the same time, and I hope I underscored this enough, and if not, I'm going to do another pitch for it here. It's about the type of assessments that we are using to really proxy their skills and how we can capitalize on what students do bring to the language learning task, because reading is a language-based process. And so if we are really hung up on using monolingual only measures, and I know that that's the currency, right? In classrooms, you are going to take English language proficiency assessments, you're going to take English only reading comprehension assessments, but there are ways to get there that may not necessarily entail teaching in the native language, but at minimum, we can't ignore that there are linguistic resources in another language, and that may be really helpful for students to be able to showcase what they know in the classroom. And so I've gotten quite a bit of pushback, I would say, from folks saying, well, something like a conceptually scored measure, how useful is it really? And like, what are we going to do with this? And as I mentioned, I think at minimum, trying to really get away from a more deficit-oriented view of what students who are linguistically diverse can and cannot do is really important if teachers can really see what the linguistic skills are if you actually account for their knowledge in both languages. And that said, I do think including monolingual English speakers, some students who are monolingual English speakers, they come from homes that for a variety of reasons, they may not be as quote unquote language rich. And so they need additional opportunities in the classroom to engage with a lot of reading, a lot of exposure, a lot of opportunities to talk. But I think that's the easiest way to kind of compare monolingual English speakers and linguistically diverse learners is really anchored on the question of English proficiency. But the actual factors that ultimately are going to influence their reading achievement are not different. How you get there and how the kind of support that you might provide a student from a Mandarin language background, for example, a student from a Spanish speaking home background, You're still going to have to provide that explicit word reading instruction. You're still going to have to focus on language development because the goal is always comprehension. And so you cannot get to language comprehension without having rich language knowledge.
Okay, thank you so much. So speaking of language assessments, quite a few have asked the question of, do you have any specific measures that you would recommend using?
Yeah, well, that's such a great question. And that goes back to, I'm here not pointing fingers and say, well, the research community or educators are doing a terrible job. On the contrary, we're doing, researchers, policymakers, educators, I think everything we can to support students. So I want to be super clear on that. The thing is that language assessment is so difficult. I mentioned from the beginning of the presentation, and I want to make a pitch for that one more time, that in schools, we tend to measure word level skills much more than we do language comprehension skills. And there are some really reasonable reasons to do that. For example, word reading measures, there are quite a bit of them. They're easy to administer, fast. You can hopefully see progress, or at minimum see where there is a lack of progress and you need to intercede and provide more intensified instruction and support. But those word reading assessments are kind of widely available and they don't take a lot of time to administer. In terms of language comprehension assessments, it is a totally different ballgame, right? There are 26 letters and about 44 sounds in the English language, a very finite skill that is a super challenge for a lot of students, especially students with learning disabilities, with dyslexia, let me be clear. But that's very different than an infinite skill like language comprehension, which I would never say, oh, I know all of the words in the English language or in the Spanish language, right? And I'm good to go forever. We're always learning and acquiring more words. And so assessing language comprehension is comparatively so much harder. So at minimum, I've showcased vocabulary, and I fully recognize vocabulary is a small part of the overall broad construct of language comprehension. There's so many ways you can assess, and you should assess language comprehension, but it takes so much time to do that. And you cannot administer that same measure day after day, week after week, even month after month, and expect to see developmental changes. So I totally get the challenges of language comprehension assessment. That said, when we at least zero in on something like vocabulary, because that's one of the areas where we have a little bit more traction in terms of the assessment availability and, you know, kind of being more psychometrically sound, that's why I showcase the conceptual vocab measures. And those are not measures that I created. The conceptual vocab measures are called the ones I used are the one word expressive and receptive vocabulary test Spanish bilingual editions. And I think these came out like in 2011 or 2012. So now it's been about a decade. And when they first came out, initially the whole idea of conceptual scoring for vocabulary has been around for many decades and has really been anchored in the early childhood years, infancy and toddlerhood, for example. And for those of you who are in the early childhood years, something like the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory, the CDI, is one such measure that's a parent report of vocab that a lot of researchers have really scored it in a conceptual way, taking into account both languages. But to my knowledge, there have not been many measures that have been developed for Spanish-English bilinguals beyond the early childhood years. So the measure that I just mentioned, the expressive and receptive one-word picture vocabulary test Spanish bilingual editions, are some of the first that I learned about that were actually developed for and normed on Spanish-English bilinguals in the US. And that's the data that I showed you. I think more work has been gaining traction in this area, but I do believe that the work that you just saw is some of the first that's really focused on using these measures at the elementary school level. And so when I have gone in and done PD for teachers across different school districts, I generally get pretty excited teachers who are somewhat surprised to see that the profiles of their students who are English learner or from non-native English speaking homes don't look as depressed as their kind of used to seeing, if that makes sense. And so that's why, to me, it may sound a little corny, I don't know. I feel that that in itself is a big win in terms of a paradigm shift. And I know it's going to take a long time. It may never happen. I hope it does at some point, but I think that really pushing for these measures, and again, it's not pushing for bilingual instruction per se. I think that would be wonderful, but that's a whole other ball game. And I purposely didn't get into the language of instruction debate because it's kind of a futile debate right now in the US, where English is the primary language of instruction. But I think it's really important for us to at least consider, okay, I can't use a measure that's not a monolingual English only measure. What does that mean? What are the implications of using only a measure that taps one of the language resources that my students might come to school with? And I have papers on that as well that I can share. Recently in the reading teacher one just came out, really anchored on hopefully trying to help teachers understand what they can do with the parameters that they have to work around, because I realize that there are some real limitations in what you can and cannot do.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful, giving specific measures. I know that that's what a lot of our participants were asking for, so thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from somebody who shared this in the chat. Let's see. Given that many NELD students are born in the United States and some overlap with low SES, how much is limited English proficiency, language comprehension correlated with the Hart and Risley research on limited exposure to words in early childhood? Also, what's the role of early childhood programs like Head Start? And in essence, how can we help these students enter kindergarten with strong language comprehension skills?
Okay, well, all right.
A lot to unpack there.
There's a lot there. And Jennifer, if I miss something, which I probably will, just cue me to, like, you missed this part. Hart and Risley, I just brought up to my class yesterday. I'm teaching a cohort that their very first reading class in special education. And I raised the Hart and Risley study. So this is like a perfect question to ask right now. I feel, and probably a lot of folks, if you're not familiar with the Hart and Risley work, in a nutshell, it's a book, something like The Everyday Lives of Young American Children, published in 1995, and that has created a lot of controversy and a lot of interest, so a lot of mixed feelings about the quantity and quality of language use and how it correlates by language status. And essentially what the researchers found, right, was that children from professional families heard and used more words compared to those from welfare families, their wording, not mine. And so it has begged a lot of questions and kind of related to the 30 million word gap, et cetera, et cetera. And this is really the kind of work that I do, right? It's related to how can we provide better language support for students that need the most support. And so I can't miss the opportunity to say that there are some methodological challenges with the Hart and Risley study in terms of there being only 40 families and how they stratified the language group based on whether you were white or African American. So that needs to be acknowledged. But with that said, there have been other studies that have essentially tried to replicate the findings across different income status, across different language groups, including bilinguals, dual language learners, whatever term you want to use, and essentially largely replicating the findings, right? So there seems to be something there that seems really natural to me to say, well, students who are exposed to more language tend to have a comparative advantage for academic learning when school is so language-based and in terms of reading development, et cetera. So I think that my answer to that question, and Jennifer, remind me if I'm missing a point, because that was a great question, but there were a lot of parts to it, would be that I am such an advocate for the kind of low-hanging fruit that is things that parents are already doing in the home. I think one of the worst things we can do is to come at parents and families with an approach that what they're doing is wrong or not supportive of their children's development. I have never personally met a parent, and maybe it's right, social desirability, who does not want their best for their child. And there are different reasons why parents are able to provide and afford different opportunities for their children. And so one of the studies that I am currently engaged with, it's a randomized controlled trial on school readiness for Spanish English bilingual students. from low-income homes is exactly on this very question of how can we support their language development in the service of later English reading comprehension achievement, knowing that the students are going to be instructed in English-only context. And what we're doing is really focusing on parents, and not focusing on parents on what are you doing that's wrong, but dispelling a lot of myths around bilingualism for parents. They hear all sorts of things in the media and elsewhere that are not scientifically based, and really focusing on what they're already doing, including things like storytelling in the home, and of course, encouraging book reading. So I think to the extent that we can really expose children to a lot of language, whether that's just orally, clearly, if you can combine that with print, that would be great. 100% behind that. But again, the approach needs to be sensitive to the realities of what families can do. And there's a lot more than we often think that parents can do, but it's kind of the approach. It's sort of like, it's not what you say, is how you say it, but it's so important. It's not just for nicety's sake, if that makes sense, but you have to get the buy-in and help parents understand the central importance that the conversations they have with their children really ultimately have for their learning. So there has recently been some controversial findings again surrounding preschool and the benefits that preschool may or may not have from children from lower income homes, many of whom are also from linguistically diverse homes. So, you know, something like preschool is not an inoculation model, right? It's not like you go to preschool, you get this hopefully great opportunity, and that's it, you're done, right? For life, you're gonna do great. It's the sustained support that students really need to get. So I'm gonna stop there and take your cue, Jennifer, because I feel like I missed some parts of that question.
No, I think that was
Okay.
it was a very detailed response. That was really helpful. And in the chat, I also included Cox Campus has a language nutrition program that they are working with parents. And then also, I didn't know if you have anything to comment on the Providence Talks, that program that was an extension decades later after Hart and Risley, if you're familiar with that, with what they were doing.
Yeah.
So there's programs kind of sprinkled throughout the nation that are really focusing on, even in the in nurseries, you know, in hospitals, where they're educating parents there and educating nurses on how to educate.
Yeah, and I think that's great. Yeah, and I tell, you know, my students, which is, you know, the closest proxy I have to trying to make a difference, right, is that language is a developmental process. Development takes time. And so all of these efforts to provide more language supports in a whole variety of ways and multisensory ways are so important. But the reality is that, right, like, you know, I don't want to pick on policymakers per se, but policymakers and schools want to see immediate results. And on some of these very critical areas, you're not going to see immediate results, but that does not mean that what you're doing is not working. You just may not see the benefit for a while. So I think all of those efforts to try to provide that language support and just world conceptual knowledge, independent of which language or languages you're using, is crucial. And I think a lot of parents don't know that as much, and sometimes hear just wrong information about don't use your home language because it's going to confuse your child and it's going to be detrimental for their English achievement. Not true. That's part of what we're doing in this intervention, is we're targeting, of course, the child and the language skills, but really working directly with the parents in a parent workshop model.
Okay, thank you. And a final question we have, this was submitted again when the participant or the attendee registered. If a student, this is, I'm going to bring it back to dyslexia. If a student is dyslexic and the school has a dual language classroom setting, is it more beneficial to continue receiving instruction in both languages, or should there be a focus on one language?
Ah, that's a great question. And they threw in the dual language instruction provided, which is rare and awesome. So the easy answer there, first of all, is that people have dyslexia across all languages, right? It's not about transparent orthography or more opaque orthography across the board. So let's be clear on that. But in addition to that very important point, students are not going to get confused because they speak more than one language or they're learning to read and write in more than one language. So the literacy and more across languages. If a student is actually identified as dyslexic, very specifically, not at risk for or struggling, but is dyslexic, the optimal situation would be to provide the reading instruction and the support services in their dominant language, because that's going to be most beneficial for the student, not because there's going to be a confusion. Again, let me be very clear about that. In the US context, that largely tends to be provide the instruction in English, because that's the most common instructional context. That's where the greater amount of resources are provided. But this question was really interesting because it really had this, it really entailed a program that can afford the opportunity to be multiliterate, right? It's not just bilingual, but biliterate as well. And if that is the case, then that is, I think, a pretty unique situation that not many students are able to take advantage of, but it still all depends on the profile of strengths and weaknesses that the child is exhibiting. And I would really be guided by what is their stronger language and probably focus on that, depending on the severity, of course, as well. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, well, thank you again for your time and this wonderful presentation. You've given us all so much to think about and to follow up on in our own classrooms, schools, with our own students. So we really appreciate that. And I also want to applaud Tennessee in general for their efforts to train teachers and faculty and educator prep programs in the science of reading and letters training. And kudos to Tennessee for your efforts.
Well,
hopefully you will start to see some of those risk ratios change for the better for all students, not just dual language learners. So thank
yes,
you.
absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I really encourage folks to reach out to me directly if there's any questions, comments. I'd be happy to engage more offline.
Okay, wonderful. And thank you all for joining, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.